Hello, and welcome to the virtual book club. And this is a little meeting called to discuss a particular book of which I'm the author. And this doesn't always happen at book clubs offline. You see, it's getting more virtual all the time. The green, because it's green on the cover, it keeps wanting to disappear. You can't see the whole book. Uh, so we've just finished reading that book, you see, but it's an online book club meeting. So it's kind of done a bit differently. Different people do book club things differently online. This is not a series. This is just a once-off for a start. That's my way of doing things. It's a bit different from the way you'll see people having little book clubs on YouTube and other places. They do a series of things. And the online book clubs do tend to be a little bit more, somebody gives you a written thing or a video that forms a kind of lecture of some sort. And there isn't so much of a two-way thing unless they have some sort of a Discord server or something where people discuss the book. And they might have a comment section or something, but you know what comment sections are like. You can't get very deep discussions on them. It's also a little bit related to what I'm doing to offline book clubs, because I wanted to sort of encourage people to think about, because I had been talking about the enshittification of the internet increasingly talking about it along with everybody else, but increasingly pointing out that there are still alternatives, even though people don't imagine that there are so much, of going to joining clubs in real life. So there are quite often book club things are free or very minimal amount of money that you pay, and you get tea and biscuits usually. I can't offer you any biscuits because it's virtual, but hopefully you can get a cup of tea, because some of the things that are virtually floating down around in my background here are things I'll be talking about today. So one other thing that might differ from either an offline or offline book club meeting would be that I'm the author of the book. So a little bit where I talk about, did I enjoy the book, which quite often turns up in book club meetings, that question, because book clubs are a great place to find other people who are reading or thinking of reading the same book as you, because sometimes you get a choice of books you want to read. You might have 3 books on the book club's list, and you pick one of those, for example, and you go off and read it. Then people, when you meet up and you come back after reading the book, you do some of these things that are up in my background here, as well as a little bit of, because I don't have a green screen, a little bit of some painting of a door, actually, that I did yesterday, turning up in my background. But we'll ignore that and pretend we're in our nice, very busy looking book club here. And you'll get, say, the people who read those 3 books turning up separately, talking about the books they read, and saying what they liked, didn't like, giving maybe a summary of plots, of characters, themes, doing a bit of analysis of the book, and basically saying if they liked the book or not. So that's what I'm going to do here today, but just with one book, my book. So I can talk about it a little bit more lengthy way than maybe traditionally you would in an offline, certainly in an offline book club. As I say, online book clubs can be a different kettle of fish, depending on what platforms the creator is using, because quite often they'll have a YouTube channel or TikTok channel or something as well, and then they'll be somewhere else as well organizing that book club, and sometimes it's paid. More often than not, it's a paid thing. But it's nice to get out in real life, I think, as well. So just to know that that's an option there, and to find stuff like that, any sort of clubs. In fact, if you look for free events in my area, you can quite often find clubs. So, whether they be skills-based clubs like learn to play chess or doing some sort of a skill, or interest-based clubs like reading, or an interest you want to get into, like reading, for example. Talking about it here takes some of the mystery out of it if you haven't been out before. And like, it's such a thing now for people are socially anxious. I have been talking about how I'm an introvert, but I'm not actually socially anxious at all. So like going to a club and talking to people, if it's a topic that would interest me a lot, like books that I know that I could talk about well, that would be not something that would make me anxious. But if you haven't been to something like that before and you're trying something new, pushing your boundaries a bit, it could be a bit anxious making. So part of what I want to do today is tell you about, first of all, about these ways of talking about books that tend to happen in these clubs, and how you can very easily teach yourself to talk about books this way, and how listening to somebody else talking about books this way is also really interesting, because you learn how to talk about books, and you get more out of books listening to what other people thought of them, and you get recommendations for books as well, or get an idea what a book is about. So it's also, whether you're intending to be a writer or a reader, it's equally helpful, you see. So the one we had, I was reading this as a series, they said there was, and it's a dystopian or science fiction novel. That's the genre of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start giving you a summary. A summary is always a good place to start if you're telling somebody about a book, right? So whether it's in conversation, even if you never joined a club, that would be what you do probably first thing. If said, oh, you're reading a book, what's it about? You know, that's always the first question, isn't it? So to start you off, in case you hadn't seen my series where I was reading it live yet, did I link to the playlist underneath? Should be the playlist should be linked to underneath this. If you haven't started the book yet or finished it and it sounds during this interesting to read, it's down there for you, so you know where to get it. But I will say, if you have a look at the little sign I have over here, it does say with spoilers. And I don't like giving spoilers on my channel, but for this book, some people had finished reading this book. I'm just going to assume some people had finished reading it, because the episodes finished. The last episode was, a few days back. So if anybody had been following the book kind of live, they would have finished it. But if you hadn't yet, you're going to learn some things about the plot that maybe you'd prefer were a surprise. Some people don't mind knowing about the whole plot beforehand. I'm slightly like that. Unless it's a kind of an adventure book. This is a bit of an adventure book. I might not like to know how it ends or something, for example, or if there are twists and turns in the story, I might not want to know those. So I'm warning you, there are spoilers in what I'm going to say, but you're okay with this first bit. Because the first bit is, I'm just going to read the blurb from the back, which is the kind of hook that authors write for a reader to be able to look at the cover of the book and tell something about what the plot is about. So I'm going to then summarize the plot afterwards, but this is the kind of hook that, invites you to read it if you think it sounds interesting, you see. So the name of the book was They Said There Was. And we know it's the genre is science fiction, so it is a dystopian novel. So They Said There Was, and then in the back the blurb says, a pandemic. The mystery virus emerged from nowhere and swept around the world. They said it was lethal and would take a terrible toll unless the cure was found and steps were taken to control its spread. Robert was terrified at the prospect of being stopped in his tracks when he was a man on his way up the ladder with success just in reach. Would they find the cure in time to save the world, or would Robert have to find other ways to survive before it destroyed him? So we know it's got it promises to be an exciting, adventurous plot around this idea of a pandemic, and that the main character is called Robert, and that the pandemic is lethal. It's going to take a terrible toll on, around the world, and that it's going to be something to do with, are they going to be able to stop the pandemic, or is Robert, who has ambitions for himself, going to be the one that's stopped? So we've got our main protagonist, as they call it, already described on the blurb, and we know something about the plot. So that's the main theme, if you like, if I can find what I'm pointing to there. Up here, you can see that's one of the things. The theme relates to the plot strongly, doesn't it? So the theme is, it's about a pandemic. So I'm going to summarize the plot briefly. So we know this guy, Robert, is a very ambitious guy. We know that already from the blurb. And we meet him right from the first chapter. And at the first chapter, the pandemic has broken out already. So spoilers are going to come in here, folks. So tune out if you haven't read it yet. And the blurb sounds interesting enough to want to start it, unless you're somebody who doesn't mind, can still get pleasure out of a book, knowing what a lot of the plot is, which I'd be like that about some books. I kind of I'm half and half. I want to know some of the plot, but not all of it before I read a book. So Robert is a guy who works at a human welfare office, right? Which is part of the human resources office. He works for the government, basically, and he believes he has a very, very important role. But his role is, we find out really early on, a kind of a filing clerk working at that place. But he's a very ambitious person. And he believes that he's in line for a manager's job very soon at this Human Resources Centre. So what did they do at the Human Resources Centre? Well, they're a kind of a welfare office, an office they deal with unemployed people. So he's a filing clerk at an unemployment office, basically. Now, this is a science fiction novel. So it's not science fiction in the sense that it's set with, like, on a different planet with aliens and things in it. But we're kind of unsure exactly when it's happening, because we don't know of anything called this Human Resources Office. Where exactly is it located? And it doesn't give us that information really early on. But we know that Robert is an ordinary kind of guy. A filing clerk is an ordinary kind of job that we understand, even if we don't really understand that office. In whose government is it, for example? What country is it in? We don't really understand that right early on. We know he's married. We know he has a job as a filing clerk in this government office that deals with unemployed people. And we see his home life at the start when this pandemic is breaking out, which he finds out about on the news. And it's we see how he feels about it and how his wife Deirdre feels about it. His wife Deirdre, who's introduced to us early on as well, she works as a teacher of children, right? So she's a kids teacher, and she was going out to work, he was going out to work, and when they heard about the pandemic on the news, that put a stop to all that fairly fast. They didn't know much about the pandemic. They were afraid, they didn't know how to control it. And so they started setting all kinds of weird rules, like people had to stay home until they really got a handle on the pandemic, because they were saying on the news it was killing people. And Robert was terribly impressed by this, because obviously it affected, or was going to affect, him and his life, because there were all these new rules about not traveling and everything. But he realized, or thought, that he was special, and because he worked for the government, that the rules wouldn't really apply to him. But he found out quite early on that they did, right? He found out from his wife, first of all, finding out that she had to take time off from work, because initially the rules that they set down were things around having to wear masks when you're out. And then they started limiting how far you could go to when you did go out, and whether you were going somewhere which was super important, like getting food, or whether you really needed to make that journey. So they were setting boundaries about how far you could go and things like that, leaving your house. And Deirdre found those rules very hard. Robert didn't find those rules as hard until he got a weird letter from his job. And the weird letter, he couldn't understand what it said. It just didn't make sense to him. And he asked Deirdre to help him make sense of the letter. And Deirdre said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Robert. Basically, I think they've let you go." So she thought Robert had been fired. He didn't believe he had been, and that she was being ridiculous. He was too important to fire, according to himself. So why he thought, the question does arise in the reader's mind, or should, I think, why he thought he was so important that he couldn't be fired. Well, it seems to have been a kind of a personality trait that he had, that whatever kind of person he was, right, he was a guy who, and this is slightly off the plot as such. This is more about a character analysis, okay? But it feeds into the plot, and it feeds into the themes in the book as well. So all these ideas up here are interrelated ideas that are kind of sections of things I'd be talking about, but you can talk about them in a slightly interchangeable way. So she says, "No, you've been let go." And he didn't want to believe that. He thinks he's too important to be let go. They couldn't possibly be letting him go. He's in line for a managerial position, and he's a man on the way up the ladder, so to speak. Now, that's a bit of a kind of, you remember I said we don't know when it's set. That's a slightly old-fashioned retro kind of way of looking at work when you're in work, because these days in the job market, they let you go anytime they want, no matter how important you are, unless you're the actual CEO, you know. But this book has a retro feel to it, and that's just from, this is an author insight now you're getting. The retro feel to it is because there are so many aspects that are AI aspects to the workplace now that had started to take effect, maybe 5 years ago, as little as 5 years ago, but which are online aspects of our life, and AI, as in ChatGPT, kind of automated tasks, kind of things that AI do, that affect the workplace so much, that had I not done it as a slightly retro feeling, dystopian feel to the book, I would have had to take those things into account as part of the plot. And I didn't want to, because that would make the plot a bigger, more tricky to understand, really, what I'm saying in the book plot. So I kept this retro feel. It does have a feel of, there's a Michael Crichton book that I like. I don't know if it's called Outbreak or Contagion, what it's called, but I had the influence of that and a 1984, Orwell's 1984 feel to it, which is a retro feel now, even though they're kind of dystopian or futuristic kind of sci-fi books, they're books which share that feeling of, you're not quite sure. Maybe they did say in the Crichton one when it was set, and I know 1984 is called 1984, but it does have this timeless feel. So I kept that feel in the book in order to keep hold of the plot devices and everything, so that people wouldn't be asking, hey, wouldn't AI affect this thing or that thing? Or, if I had kept it, definitely set in 2025 or later, you see, it's the retro feel to it is actually a little bit helps the believability of it as being something that could happen at some time that we're not sure of, and adds a slight disequilibrium to the book, which I quite like, because there are points, and especially at the end of the book, that I want the book to be asking the reader questions, which the reader has to then solve to their own satisfaction. So I want to have those spaces in there for the reader's imagination. However, it is a very easy to grasp plot. And part of this is because it's not written in Robert's voice, the first person being Robert. It's written in a third person voice, but in the kind of language that Robert would use to describe things. And we do discover early on that Robert is a very simplistic kind of a thinker. He's like really somebody who, as a kid, believed everything adults told him, but never grew up from that position. He's still got that kind of childish position of trusting everything at face value. And that turns out to be not a helpful thing at all as the plot goes on, because he put his trust in the government and put his trust in the idea that the role you play in a job is who you are and where you fit in a society. Okay, so he bought into that completely, that idea, and that if you played the role really well and did your work the way you were supposed to do it, not even like work super hard or show creativity or imagination or anything. Deirdre is quite like that, but he's not. He's quite a rigid personality who identifies 100% with his role for most of the book. And he believes if he does that, if he identifies very strongly with that work role, that it's going to happen for him the way he's been told it will happen, the way society has led him to believe that there is a payoff of you go up a ladder in that society if you do your job the way it's supposed to be done. And he does make some efforts in the job and everything to smile when he doesn't feel like smiling, or make the appropriate sort of facial responses to people, because he doesn't seem to understand emotions terribly well. And even with his wife, you can see that he's emotionally, he doesn't have a big vocabulary emotionally, and only understands clues like his wife getting angry with him because she has a furrow in her brow, and that's the furrow in her brow she gets when she's angry. So he can tell physically when somebody might be angry, but it's really kind of a guess. It's not really based on a connection. And we see, as part of his character, so we're looking at this at the moment, character, as part of his character, that he doesn't make strong connections with people, which is okay at work, as it turns out, because he just has to make a good mimicry of smile when you're supposed to smile, don't smile when you're not supposed to. And sometimes somebody even puts up a helpful poster to give you a clue about when you're supposed to do it, and this is how you get your promotion. So his plan is to keep doing that, and he is going to move up the ladder. And he's very interested in that because he's a very other-directed person, and with all his neighbors and everything, he's always thinking about his neighbors watching him and his status within a society. So he wants to fit in, right? And he wants his rewards of doing his bit. But at the same time, he does like doing his bit, and he loves working because it makes him feel important. He doesn't seem to have anything else that really makes him feel important, because he doesn't have much in the way of connection with even his wife. And we find out as we go along, he doesn't have a whole lot of imagination either. And Deirdre is kind of the other character that brings this into focus, because even when he met her, he says they just kind of drifted into marriage because it's what you do, you know. So, you know, he's a kind of a character that you might meet a lot of in your life, because he's the guy out washing his car every weekend and his wife's car every second weekend, or out, you see him out doing the windows of the house because he can't leave the windows too long because the neighbors will think um, your house is dirty, or the same mowing the grass and things like that. There's a lot of duties that he does and everything, but there's not a whole lot of pleasure in his life, except this one thing that gives him a lot of pleasure, which is about thinking about the promotion. And when he gets the promotion, he'll be like a better person because he'll have a better role that's equated with being a better person. And Deirdre doesn't do things that way. His wife doesn't really do things that way. The wife is a much warmer kind of a person, likes connecting with people, and even with the kids when she has to teach the kids at home during the pandemic. She's connecting with them in a very warm and empathetic kind of way, and in fact tries to connect with Robert in an empathetic way when he loses his job, for example. But he shuts down completely the idea of her helping him understand that the letter is him being fired, because that thought must not enter his world, because that's his whole plan, getting promoted, you see. And that's his life has been derailed completely. And already at this stage, when you're reading, you kind of realize, well, what else has he got left? He's really only got Deirdre. What influence is Deirdre going to be? Because he doesn't have friends around, and he doesn't like her friends calling around. He doesn't really get what relationships outside work would be about or anything like that. But Deirdre's creativity and her hobbies and all this, she grows things in the garden. And when she's laid off work at first, she starts doing not just kids' art projects, but her own art projects, and starts doing things like courses to learn how to teach the kids online and things like that, and reading lots of books and getting into that. He disses all that kind of stuff as if it's stupid, but then again, he very much has the idea that roles within the society he's in are very patriarchal ones, because his general attitude to her is one of dissing everything that she does. So her all her plants in the garden would be just classified as weeds. Like, why would you want to grow weeds? Because you can buy vegetables in a shop. Why would you want to do art? You know, why does she want to do art? Because she's stupid, basically. In his thinking, he is the important one. He's the breadwinner, and he sees himself as the breadwinner, the one that goes out, the one that is going to be climbing this ladder and getting the promotion soon and everything. She's very much a supporting role. And the only things that she does that are worthwhile to him are getting the dinner on time, basically. And he doesn't really appreciate her, you know, keeping the house up, because he doesn't do housework or anything either. So he doesn't appreciate that until more restrictions come in to do with the pandemic, which have to do with obsessive cleaning to get rid of these germs of things, or whatever way it's a virus, whatever way the virus is transmitted, it's invisibly transmitted. So you have to clean everything obsessively with all kinds of, um, cleaners that you buy. And of course, the cleaner that you have in your house is the wife, and they have disharmony over that as well. So not just disharmony over the fact that she is moving around extra hobby stuff in his living room. He sees the house as very much his, even though she's working as well. Him being head of household, really, you know, he's letting her do things, but he doesn't value anything that she does. So So we can kind of see with that kind of personality why he can't accept he's been fired, right? Now, we're very clear he has been because we've read the letter as well. And it's clearly, although the language is very rambling in a very sort of office speak kind of way, we're fairly sure, yeah, he's been fired, all right. Um, and he doesn't want to accept it. So his way of accepting it is saying, well, no, they just don't need me at the moment because of the pandemic. But I'm going to, in my spare room, which I have set up already for a few files, because I like doing work at home, because he doesn't really have much of a home life at all. Does have more so now that the pandemic started, because he's really into watching the news and he loves stats. He's kind of a stats nerd and he loves collecting stats, and he's really his own little obsessive side is coming out more because he's hooked on listening to the news broadcasts about where the pandemic is going, because he sees it as something that affects him. Whether or not he goes to work, how long it's going to take him to get to work because of all the restrictions along the way. And some of the plot is going over how silly some of the restrictions are that are put in place during the pandemic, that how much they interfere with people's lives. For example, in Deirdre's case, she's a very sociable person and she can't see any of her friends. And at first she was coping going around to the local park, and then, trying to do, take up painting, to be able to paint things that were in the local park, take photos, come home, do that. And she wasn't very good at it. Then she wanted to go back and socialize with her friends, and she was doing it over the phone, but she wasn't able to meet them for things like birthdays. And she really suffered very badly over that, whereas he didn't, because he doesn't really like people. So, but then when he's staying home and he's been fired, but he either won't admit he's been fired or he can't accept that he's been fired. It's hard to tell which, hopefully, in the novel. But he does insist, no, he definitely hasn't been, and he's going to keep working away. It becomes increasingly difficult for him to work away because he finds things like his login password gone. And then comes that horrible moment when he goes to work. He says, I'm just going to have to go in person. So he goes out, faces roadblocks and checks for, vaccine passports and things like that, because waiting to get his vaccine jab, or jabs as it turns out, because there are multiples of them, that they keep saying, oh no, it didn't work as well as we thought it might work. And we're going to quarantine you all again for another while, and then wait until a new lot of injections come in, and then you can all queue up and go for injections again. They keep doing this all the time. So they're putting on controls and then releasing them a little bit and then putting on the rules again. And people don't know if they're coming or going. And all sorts of businesses are having to close and everything. And people having to do like crazy things just to, get their groceries and everything. And so he's struggling to get back to work in the car, and manages to get past all the roadblocks and everything, and can't get into the building because his swipe card doesn't work anymore. So he sneaks into the building when the smokers that he's always thinking about reporting come out of the building, and he sneaks in under their arm the minute they open the door, and goes up, and he's on the unemployed side of the desk this time. Now, he hates the unemployed because he represents the government, and the unemployed represent people who won't get a job because they're lazy. In his mind, because he believes everything that's in the government training manuals and everything. And this is how they do the interviews with the unemployed and everything, assuming that they're feckless wasters, and trying to find ways to stop them being able to claim any kind of assistance off the government at all, i.e. money. and, believing that they're all going to drink it away, and they're all going around on, robbing drinking sprees all the time, and they're real ne'er-do-goods. So the great unwashed, they're referred to in the Human Resource Welfare Office. So he is on the unemployed side of the desk this time, with the big smash-proof glass between him and the worker, and he says, I need to see the manager in person, because he was having terrible trouble actually getting to talk to the manager about this letter to clarify when he was coming back in and all this, or when his files were going to be sent out to him for him to work on, because he'd nothing to work on, you see, and he couldn't even log in. So they say to him, what are you doing here, And he says, I want to see the manager. And somebody goes and gets the manager, and the manager comes out and tells him to go away. Basically tells him again, you were fired, go away, But he tells him very directly this time that he was actually fired. And it is a moment of horror for Robert, because that's the moment in which his world falls apart. And he gets kind of escorted out by the security guard and told to leave the car park after he's sitting there in shock in his car for a while, and then goes back home. So he's finally accepted that he has been fired, but he's in shock with that. But he also has the problem that he won't talk to his wife about it. And his wife is increasingly locked out, because every time she tries to communicate with him about it, he shuts her down and becomes angrier and everything. So she has no way in to talk to him. And he is becoming very weird and walking away from her every time and everything. And she has her own pressures, because she cracks at one stage and starts crying all over the place and saying, I'm lonely, I can't go out and see anybody anymore, I have nothing and I'm lonely. So she doesn't have him, because they never communicated well anyway, by the looks of the style that his communications happens in. There's a lot of fake stuff in it. So she says, either you talk to me about it. She gives him an ultimatum. She says, either of you talk to me about it, or I'm going. And I'll go and stay with my parents, and I'll ring you again in about a month. But if you don't talk to me then, I'll stay gone. I'll just come back and get my things, but I'll basically stay gone. So it's an ultimatum. But he sort of goes into very defensive mode about it and calls her everything he can in his own mind, and then doesn't say yes, he'll talk to her or anything like this. Just sits there and broods after they're finished. After she goes, she gets some stuff and goes. He sits there brooding and wondering what to do with himself, still watching the news, being obsessed about it, still holding on to the idea that he might somehow be called back and get his job back, because he just can't believe that he doesn't have this role anymore and isn't on the ladder to any promotion, and fired, and that he's an unemployed now. You see, it's like the worst case scenario for him, because he hates the unemployed. So the wife leaving is actually the least of his problems, until he realizes that it's very difficult to do anything in the house without her. He's not out at work all day, so he's at home and he's having to feed himself and not disappear in a mountain of rubbish at home. And that's quite difficult, and he doesn't know where anything is. And he can't even keep up appearances, really, because the pandemic caused all kinds of weird side effects, like you couldn't get, he told his wife to get his suits cleaned for work. And even though he was working at home, he said he still had to keep up appearances, and he couldn't be seen to be slovenly at home. So he's identified with his role that much that, like, he's basically looks like, you all know people like this, I'm sure. He looks like an office worker even when he's at home, and when he wears weekend clothes, they look funny on him, and he doesn't feel comfortable in them or anything. So all his suits shrank because he had her wash them because there was nowhere open to dry clean them, you know. So he wrecked all these suits, and he looks really kind of shabby, like very quickly after she's gone and he's on his own, and has dreadful difficulty feeding himself, keeping clothes clean, keeping the house clean, things like that, and not really motivated to do it because he's saying to himself, that bitch, he's saying to himself, is going to come back. She'll come back with her tail between her legs, because he can't imagine her existing without him, because it's like people who identify really strongly with their roles and who think of other people as just kind of secondary characters to themselves, if you like, in their lives. They can't imagine anybody else stepping out of the role around them either, you know. That's what I mean about them being rigid thinkers. So he's convinced she's going to come back. But the time passes, like, you know, because she said she wasn't going to ring him for like a few weeks, you know, and the time passes, and he manages a bit to kind of do the basics, barely feeding himself, but he was kind of not kind of keeping the house clean or anything like that. And it is sort of a comedy of errors continuing as it goes along, because the comedy of errors in his life really started with the pandemic rules and how ridiculous those were, but how ridiculous he is in a home environment without the other person that was in his life performing a role in his life. It shows that he can't do any other role. He's not particularly adaptable, except that he does learn a little bit because he has to learn. So he does start learning a little bit even when she's gone. So already there's some kind of a change happening a little bit in him, even though he's still got his rigid idea about he's not really fired and she's coming back. And they're going to find a cure for the big virus and everything. Like, everything's going to work out. He's actually kind of an optimist in life, but only because he's so naive, if you know what I mean. So, so the next thing that happens, he's still obsessed with what's going on online and everything. And the next thing that happens is while his wife is away, he meets somebody online. And this is my kind of only nod to the whole AI universe and the whole thing. He meets somebody on a platform called Metaversal, which, you know, might or might not be inspired by platforms we have at the moment. But the metaversal environment is an app online, basically. And he only ran into it because somebody was, he was looking for photos of his wife, because he was convinced that his wife was going away on a holiday somewhere without him, and possibly with somebody else. He did have this fear that she might actually leave him for somebody else, that she wouldn't be able to survive financially on her own. Like him, he can't survive financially on his own because he only has a filing clerk's wages. And he doesn't have those now because he's been fired. So, you know, although he hasn't really processed that idea all the way yet, he does understand, to a large extent, he's been fired after having it explained to him in a very humiliating way at his human welfare office. And so he's online checking her accounts to see, can he see photos of her either with her parents or with somebody else, because he's starting to get concerned that maybe, you get the idea that maybe he's thinking maybe she mightn't come back. What if? You see that idea kind of lurking somewhere underneath at this stage, because some reality is starting to set in with them at this stage, that things aren't exactly as he thought they were already, because now he's an unemployed, not a person on a ladder for promotion to managerial status, and in the new car that comes with it, and, you know, slight upgrade in your ties you can get from that, and other like little perks of people sucking up to you and things at work, and trying to please you. Um, some reality is starting to creep in, and that's the thing with reality, isn't it? Once a little bit creeps in, you're accessible to change and being able to accept a different path in life. So some of the rigidity is kind of going to go out of you, but that's kind of often comes from a horrible experience. And that's a horrible experience for him, getting fired. About the worst thing that can happen to Robert is that getting fired, because it just came completely out of the blue. And it does really ruin him, because although when he goes to check to see can he find recent photos of his wife online to see what she's up to, he discovers this metaversal app that she had been in, and he discovers a new person called Bruna in that app that he just starts a conversation with, because she's a nurse and she's talking about the pandemic and knows a lot about the pandemic. And he started talking to her. He becomes friends with her, right, about this pandemic topic. And that's a new thing in his life, really, having a friend, because he never really seemed to have seen any need for it before, because he identified so strongly with his role that everything he did was in service of that role. And he had no imaginative leftovers left for wanting anything else. But now he has a lot of time on his hands and no work to do. So he's kind of filling in time, and he's still interested in what's happening with the pandemic, not as much as he was, because he kind of does realize he's been fired. But he's talking to Bruna, and Bruna is saying she's a nurse, and they hang out in Metaversal, where you can become a different avatar to yourself. So this is a new kind of him. He becomes he picked a cowboy avatar, so he became a Cowboy Bill, or Cowboy Bill and Bruna were kind of their avatars in this metaversal space when they were talking to each other. But Bruna becomes more than a source of information about the pandemic, and more than a friend, because she arouses feelings in him that he hasn't really felt for a while. And you get the impression they were never really passionate in their marriage, although the reason that they didn't have kids in the marriage was not that they weren't having sex. It was that they he didn't want children, and he didn't have that urge to have children, didn't really like children, didn't like people, basically. So why would he want kids, you see? And she had wanted kids. So that possibly was something that pushed them slightly further apart. I don't know. But he just came across as passionless himself, because he didn't have a passion for people. So, and that sort of space where sex should be, you find out he was sleeping with his wife maybe twice a week, but that was kind of it. He talks about it in the same casual way he talks about having a dinner, that it's something you don't really notice. You only notice when it's gone, maybe, because when Bruna turns up, he does notice that she's being rather sexual about things, and that she's a very sensual woman, and that their relationship, he has feelings for her that are definitely sexual feelings, but she is acting like she's in love with him. He's convinced at fairly early stage that she's in love with him, and she wants to meet him and all this. But she has to do all this kind of African nursing first for the pandemic. And when that's done, they can meet up. But she starts wanting little gifts from him. And this escalates quite quickly. And some of the gifts are paying for webcam rooms, for like paying for a year or two in advance just to talk to her in that, uh, on that website, which is her sort of, he's saying, oh, webcam environment. But he seems a little naive about how online things work because you didn't really know about metaversal or anything. So this retro feeling kind of creeps in again, but it kind of goes along with his naivete in other respects about how the world works, because he has a very retro attitude to um, um, how different industries need workers sometimes and don't at other times, you see. And it's a very old-fashioned way of thinking. The job for life kind of, or working your way up, is a very old-fashioned way of thinking. And so this thing about not being very savvy about being online is kind of an extension of that kind of naivete, you know. And she takes him for everything that he's got. Because there is a lot of comedy in it, but it's kind of sad as well, because at the beginning of the book, he was a character that I did think about this as an author. I did think about this. How am I going to make this character despicable, unlikable character, but still character you want to read about? Uh, is he going to have any saving graces at all, or am I just going to have fun writing a totally despicable character, but possibly alienate the reader so much from him because he's so despicable, you aren't interested enough in him for the whole novel to be able to continue with it? So that was on my mind. So the way the story developed as I was thinking it through, I thought, no, this is some of his humanity is going to emerge during this terrible experience, because that is part of some of the, if I can get my finger to work to point to this bit up here, it doesn't always want to work, there, up there, themes. um, he, through really lousy experiences that happen to him, he has to let go to a certain extent of his old identification with his old role and start becoming a new person, or he's not going to survive. As it said on the blurb of the cover, will he survive, you know? That's more of a threat to him than the pandemic is throughout the entire book, even though he spends half his time trooping back and forth, queuing up for injections and things like this, and getting angry about all the queues he has to go into in life that usually only the unwashed have to do, you know. But so he has to start changing, you see, and this is the start of him as a human being developing his humanity a bit. So he is feeling something that could be love for Bruna, but there's such a huge dose of wanting to use her in it, because he is a kind of a tactician in life. He just thinks that you do something to get the payoff. So he's always looking for the payoff and things, and he's looking for the payoff from Bruna, and the payoff would be that she wants to marry him and she can become the new wife, because Deirdre has wrung him back and they haven't gotten back together, and she is sending divorce papers now because he didn't want to speak to her about it. And since meeting Bruna, he's going, no, Bruna would be much better anyway. You know, he's a lot keener on Bruna, and Bruna is telling him everything he wants to know. And oh, she loves housework too, as well as being gorgeous big bosomed and arousing feelings in him that he really didn't have for Deirdre, or didn't seem to have for Deirdre. She's saying all the right things, you see. So she might be a great replacement for Deirdre as a wife, and she does want to marry him, and she's working. So that would be fabulous. And people at work would be mad jealous of them when he gets his job back, because he still moves between thinking, yeah, I've been fired, and thinking, no, but I might have a chance to get my job back. Maybe they'll call me back in the future, because, you know, that's the way it works when you're that strongly identified with something. You have lapses of thinking you can go back to the old life kind of thing, you know. So he does a lot of that. But he has to do a lot of lying to Bruna. So he doesn't want to let on to Bruna he's been let go from his job. So he decides, well, she might be house cleaner and cook and all that as wife. And that'd be great, because that was what I really liked in a wife. But also, I have to do work to get her, because she's kind of what you'd call a high value woman, in that you have to put in a lot to get a lot, you know. It's a very transactional way of looking at people, but you know, it's how he thinks. And he thinks that she would be a great catch, because say they go on, he'd say he gets his job back and they go on holidays together the way Deirdre and himself used to. Bruna's going to look so much better in the photos, and everybody at work is going to be so jealous of that and everything. And, you know, he then buys into the whole fantasy again, and I can get my manager's job. And, you know, he's back in that kind of thinking. You know, it doesn't change overnight, does it, this development thing? So he has to clean the house to get it ready for Bruna's arrival. And, you know, that is not an easy process. Because you can get yourself into quite a pickle when you've never done it before. And he gets himself into a pickle around the local shop as well, stealing some cheese. And, you know, things go off the rail all over the place. But the worst thing is that when he's trying to tidy himself up for Bruna, buying new suits and everything to do it, Bruna manages to get the last of his money out of him, because she says, oh, the divorce has come through. Oh, that's wonderful. And, you know, I did want you to ask you to marry me. And I didn't want to say it before, but there's an engagement ring I want. So she manages to get, he balks at the price of it on her wish list. And kind of goes, you know, he's more in touch with reality, and he's going, well, I've darn all money left now. I've spent so much of my last paycheck. I've very little money left. That would ruin me. And I don't know if or when I'm going back to work. But he really wanted Bruna badly, and he felt that she was part of the plan to rehabilitate himself and get the status and the position back that he had in life, that is kind of owed to him, he feels. So you have to, you know, no pain, no gain. So he needs a little help, and Bruna is really good at conning him. And Bruna says that some doctor has reconnected with her. She used to know him from ages ago, and he's still in love with her and wants to bring her on holiday. And this is the wonderful huge bunch of flowers he bought her and everything. And then she doesn't communicate with Robert for a while. So Robert panics. And when she gets in touch with him again, says, I'm going to buy your ring and everything, and I really want to propose. He buys the ring, and then Bruna disappears. And time goes on, and it's like the job thing. You have to accept reality eventually. So quite a while goes on, and he becomes very badly broke, to the extent where his electricity is gone, his internet is gone, obviously. No sign of any job coming back, because even his phone is gone now. All his connection with anything to do with his role or his former life is going. He just has the kind of remains of a shell of a house that he's in. And he had developed an obsession with another character that turned up earlier as a kind of a just popping up every once in a while, somebody that he used to see in the neighborhood that he was kind of curious about, but he didn't have much in the way of one-to-one interactions with her. But it's this character, Chris, and it turns out she lives next door, and she's a scruffy individual with a bike that he sees first bringing logs into the house, and he thinks she's visiting somebody next door, and he thinks she's very odd. And he sees her around in the shop once with no mask, and he's really angry about that because he hates anybody that doesn't follow the rules and doesn't wear masks and has a fantasy about reporting people all the time, but is too cowardly to actually do so because he doesn't really want the attention on himself. And he wouldn't do that anymore because he doesn't even have the means really to do that. But he keeps watching this one to see what she's up to because she's one of the only things on his horizon now because he doesn't have anything to do with himself during the day. He doesn't even have heat on in the house, and it's winter now and it's freezing in the house. He's running out of food. The few little bits that he has in the cupboard are things like spices and porridge and things like that he's not even sure how you cook. And he's gone through a lot of what he did manage to cook very badly. And he's basically starving at this stage, starting to starve. So he's becoming a different person, and he does things in the evening like going out and looking at the sky and the moon and things like that he never did before. And just sort of, there are moments where it's daydreamy. And then he has moments where he is dreaming at night, where he never seemed to before have anything extra, any extra imagination or creativity at all. Now he's having nightmares and things, which doesn't sound very good, but it does seem to be a process of changing going on. So he's out in the back garden one day. I was part of his cleaning up for Bruna arriving because it took him a while to accept that she wasn't going to arrive. So he was cleaning up the weeds, as he put it, that Deirdre had, which had gone very weedy at this stage because she'd been away so long. And he sees the Chris one through the bushes of the garden and sees smoke coming over the bushes and is looking, what the hell is she up to? And she's got a big fire in the garden with big logs sticking out of her. And he thinks this is all very odd. And she's cooking stuff on the stove. And she sees him looking at her through the bush. And she says, look, I know you've been watching me for a while. Do you want a cup of tea? And she passes a cup of tea through the bush to him, and he hasn't even had tea in a while because he hasn't had milk, he hasn't had tea bags, everything's gone in his house basically, and he's at starvation and freezing stage now. So he takes the tea, and it's nettle tea, and he's not very happy about that. But he goes out in the garden to watch her a few times, and she invites him for a meal that she's cooking in the garden at one stage. So when he goes for that meal, she cooks a meal, and it's, basically she seems to be at starvation levels as well. She doesn't have anything sort of supermarket-y to eat either. But she has various kind of foraged things that she's added to the pot, and tea that's made out of nettles again. And they are talking a little bit. And he finds her a weirdo because she thinks that the pandemic isn't what meets the eye and that there's an agenda behind it, a government agenda. Now, she knows that he's starving like her, and she says, well, everybody is. And her argument is, and this is where the book becomes a bit open-ended, right? She's trying to persuade him that the government are trying to actively kill people off, that they want to have less people to look after or something. but that's the plan, to kill off a lot of people, and that they're doing it by starving them, depriving them of jobs and things like that. And that the reason she knows this, he thinks this sounds mad, and she says the reason she knows this is that she points to two bits of what she thinks of as evidence: lights going off in houses in the street and hearses. Now, a reader, and I wanted it like that, a reader might go, is that evidence of people being killed off, though? Or is she jumping to conclusions? Because she actually admits she doesn't know anybody personally. So she seems to be kind of out of the loop to a large extent, like him as well, in that she's kind of an outsider type anyway, because she wasn't, if you remember early on, she wasn't going along with any of the rules. So she might have been an outsider from much earlier on who wasn't getting a lot of information from people anyway. But she did also say that people didn't want to give information within that whole kind of identification with roles within a society, sort of society that was all, under orders from the government to play along by doing this, and this, and this to stick to rules that were enforced during the pandemic, you see. And people like Robert, or there were a lot of people like Robert who loved going along with the rules, you see. So it was very hard to know what reality was. And, he was somebody with all the statistics about it and everything, but he had kind of said at certain points he couldn't keep up with the statistics because they were all framed in different kinds of charts. And when you tried to relate them to each other, it was very difficult to get them all to hang together, you see. So neither of them really had access to whatever it took to get a real picture of what was really happening in that pandemic, except that they did have the facts of both their lives being very negatively influenced by it, because they were both now at the stage of starving, and sort of it isn't kind of overtly said, but kind of hiding their situation to a large extent, her to go under the radar of police and people like that, enforcers for the state, basically, and him to hide the shame of being unemployed. And he wouldn't even see himself as somebody able to go and try to go to the unemployed office and claim money, because they'd laugh him out of it and try and put him off it, the way he said they did in interviews with the unemployed, that they go bring them through interviews in which they try all sorts of tricks to try and stop them claiming what they're supposed to be able to claim, So they're both very stuck, and they're kind of shoved together by this kind of sharing the meal situation. And, she says to him, like, I realize you're starving as well and you look very ill. So perhaps there's this kind of the idea of empathy, because you can't imagine him doing the same thing with somebody. And as if to prove the point, the instant where she's saying, look, you're starving as well, he says something about having some sort of soup mix or something like that. She said, it's a pity I don't have this, that, or the other thing. And he said something about, I might have soup mix or something, because he didn't have a way of cooking anything hot anymore either. And some of the things he had left were things that you couldn't eat. So he had a couple of things that he either didn't know what to do with or that he couldn't eat. And she suggested that they pool resources and that she cook the thing if he donated a little bit of what he had that he couldn't cook, that she would cook it and he could either come over and eat it or take it away and eat it at home. So it was a two-way kind of situation. You give something and I give something. And he could relate to that. But at the same time, when he called over to her house, he thought, after being swindled by Bruna, who he was very, very angry at, and it was really like the lowest point for him, because she was kind of somebody that was going to save him from a lot of what was happening. He was in a place of such deep distrust of everybody that he was convinced she must have food hiding under her bed or something, because she said, well, you can look in my cupboards, and if there's anything like you want or anything in the cupboards, I don't have much, but if there's anything I can give you in return for the food you donated, have a look. And he was very angry when he saw she just kind of bits of green things and everything that looked like Deirdre's weeds gathered from the garden that were nettles and things like that, And he went and looked in the bathroom and under the bed in the bedroom and things, and was quite angry that she didn't have anything really in return. But when they had the meal together, she had the meal this time in the living room, and it was a bit of an event, an occasion, because they both dressed up a little, even though she was much older than him, and you could tell they probably weren't going to have any kind of a romantic relationship or anything, although it is open-ended at the end of the book. So all these are all imagination spaces for the viewer to have their own kind of ending to the book if they want. There is a kind of an ending, but it's an open-ended ending. So they share the meal, and he thought the meal was fantastic because she managed to make some kind of bread, and the meal actually tasted great, and he was warm sitting in front of a fire that she'd made inside. Now, she made the fire from furniture and things like that, but it shows you that you can go in life, right? This is part of kind of a theme again, not just a bare plot, but the whole theme that underlies the plot is that plans don't always work out in life, but that sometimes when plans go disastrously wrong, life intervenes somehow, or random acts of fate or whatever. Things can go terribly wrong, that something new can happen. And in that space of something new happening, there can be some kind of growth, even though survival is not guaranteed at the end of it. You might be still growing more as a human being. So he is starting to grow a bit as a human being, because even to be able to realize how beautiful a meal can be when you're really, really hungry and a little bit of heat of a fire, the guy was kind of in ecstasy over that, and had a very fell asleep in front of the fire after having a full tummy. It's not much to want in life, is it? But it's kind of a base need. If you were looking at sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something, the need to be safe, secure, with a roof over your head is kind of at the base level. And these two, at this stage in this dystopian novel, don't really have that, their base needs met. So they're really struggling for survival here, and they're both at the edge of starvation. But right at the edge of something like that, there can be this kind of, it's like a transformative moment. It's a bit of I think of it as the Last Supper scene and the breaking of the bread and all this. It's a transformative moment, definitely, for him. And he was a person that, really needed some kind of transformation in his life. Now, whether it solves all his problems or not is quite another thing. And in another kind of reality or another timeline, his original identification with his role so strongly and everything might have worked out for him. And he might have climbed the ladder. He might have been a manager. He might have been perfectly happy. to have a bigger car and have people lick up to him and everything. And that might have been satisfaction enough for him in his life, because he wasn't a very imaginative person, was he? That might have been all that guy needed. So, but it didn't work out like that. So it was a book about, uh, you know, growth and having to be adaptable and everything in life. And um, sort of the last scene in the book, he is voluntarily, because he doesn't have anything else now. He's voluntarily hanging around with the next door neighbor, Chris, now, because they're kind of semi-reliant on each other at this stage, for food and heat. And to some extent, that seems to be growing a little bit, for um, for communication about what's happening with the virus and everything, because he's kind of considering new ideas. He's considering, no matter how crazy this idea she has about what the pandemic is, it might be worth considering. And he's become suddenly both philosophical and more imaginative, because you have to become more imaginative when this new wacky situation happens and you're not doing well in it, because you're a problem-solving creature, and they're now reduced to basically cavemen status, because it's just mere survival from the elements at this stage that they're working against. And their time in their houses might be limited as well, because there are bills associated with all that as well, you see. So they're sitting in around the campfire in the back garden, and talking and listening to birds as they're making tea, right? Or she's making tea. And they're listening to the birds singing, and he says that he gets the bright idea that you can eat the birds. They're tiny, but you can eat them. And she said, rather philosophically, that the birds can wait a while, because sometimes in life you need more than just food to feed you, which is a very philosophical thing to say, isn't it? Especially when you're starving. But he kind of gets it, because he says, but is it worth it? Is it worth it if you're just struggling for survival? So that's a very, that's the kind of like, what's the bottom line of why we're here kind of thing, And he realizes they're right down to the wire, and he's asking her opinion on it, which he never really has with anybody before. He listened to authority figures a lot before, but he never really asked anybody else, except asking Deirdre about the letter or what it meant. And then he wanted to reject it when it didn't mean what he thought it meant. So this is kind of growth in his thinking, I think, even though it's incredibly negative, he is philosophizing about the basic, reason. What basic reason is there to be there when things are that bad? And she says, because because hope is very important. And I hope you know how important hope is. And he did actually, you realize he did have hope, because he hoped against all probability of getting his job back and everything. And really him saying, is there any point? It was giving up of hope, but is it, for a moment you wonder, has he lost hope? Because that would be the very last thing that he has that he's losing, you see, if he did. And he thinks about it, and then he gets a stick off the ground and tries to draw a bird on the ground. And that is that's a very important image in the book at the end of the book, because he's found his creativity in asking those questions, very important questions about life. And he's actually drawing something in the ground, which I could never imagine him doing before. He used to hate it when Deirdre did anything, but he's philosophizing and drawing. And I think that people really at the end of their tether, you think that art doesn't really do much, but what I'm saying in that is, yeah, it does. The art of a bird singing or something makes a huge difference. You know, when there's nothing else. So that is the end of the book, but it then stops, and there's a little postscript, and the postscript is from the Ministry of Human Resources, and it says that this document was found, fictional document, that the writer, the name of the writer isn't known, who that is, and that nobody ever lived in the house that it was found in. And but that, it exists as a work of fiction, and you're allowed to take it out of the Library of Human Resources for during your recreational reading time during the day. So it becomes clear then that even recreational or imaginative thought is constrained at whatever time that we are in now reading this novel. So if this is where the open-endedness of the book is. So if they're saying there was nobody of that name that wrote that down, and the people in the book are all fictional and everything and never existed, what happened at the end of the book? Because that scene around the campfire where he's drawn the bird on the ground, that's the last scene. And did they run off into the wilds or what? Because Robert used to get really uncomfortable when she was talking to him about camping and getting camping equipment and everything. And, she was into kind of foraging skills and everything. So perhaps they went off into the wild, or did the government get their hands on them because they were threatening arrests all the way through it? Were they killed? Is Chris right that they were killing people? Did they arrive and just haul them off somewhere and kill them? Or what? You see, it's an open question, but I know people don't really like endings that aren't definite, but I think depending on the reader, you're going to have an ending that feels right for you as a reader, you see. And it is a book about imagination as well. That's one of the main themes in it, right? About the difference between somebody who just believes everything they're told and listens to authoritative figures tell them what to do, believes all that, and somebody who's creative, imaginative, and kind of has their own way of doing things, like Deirdre, who kind of thought a lot of the restrictions and everything were a bit much, and that it wasn't right to keep people away from their friends and all this kind of thing, and that it was very damaging to people and everything. And she broke the rules regularly because of that, whereas he would be incensed at the idea of somebody breaking the rules. But he didn't have the imagination to see about why they might. He didn't even have the imagination to see, really, to have insight into why Deirdre left him. You know what I mean? But he did later develop more insight. I don't know if he ever developed empathy, but again, that's open. That's why it's open at the end of that book, because there could be more story to it afterwards that the reader might like to think about. And I think that that's very important in books. I know I've gone on a very long time, but I do think that's very important in books to leave space to think about them when you're reading them, and afterwards to let them really sink in. And definitely we live at the moment in a very time that's very difficult to find time. We're not quite at the stage where you're only allowed an hour or so, a recreational hour or so, to have a thinking time. As in this book apparently happened, at the end with that postscript bit. But I do think it pays off to do so, because books are meant to be kind of absorbed and then processed and then thought about a bit more. So I hope you enjoyed that. And definitely, if you were going out to a book club or online to a book club, the book club meeting might not be the same as this. This is more like, a much longer kind of a thing. You'd probably get, you'd probably get a few people talking about the books they were reading and everything in a much shorter way, but I'm indulging myself a bit because it was my book, and there aren't other people in the meeting except, somebody who virtually stops by or something. But yeah, so if you haven't read the book and you want to read the book, I hope I didn't spoil it completely for you. But as I say, some readers do like knowing a lot or all of a plot before they read a book, because you can still enjoy all the things unfolding in the book and find more things than somebody told you about in the book. And in fact, that's why, like, a lot of people, like myself included, read books several times in their life, the same book, because they should, if they're put together well, and the ideas are good, they should give different things every time, that you find different little things in them to interest you or delight you or to think about. So thank you very much for joining me for all the episodes are underneath, and for this little book club meet as well. And whether you decide to join book club or not, reading's a lovely thing to do. Bye bye.